The year is 1989. Capcom just released the video game version of the movie Sweet Home. One of the earliest horror games, this Famicom title was widely received well and would even take home a Critics' Choice Award from Famitsu Best Hit Game Awards. Fast forward to 1993, Shinji Mikami was tasked by Capcom to make a game building on the systems of Sweet Home. That game would be known in Japan as Biohazard, but to the rest of the world, the game would be known as Resident Evil. This game would spawn one of the most prolific franchises in gaming. That first game was my very first PS1 game ever, and I remember booting it up for the first time and being absolutely horrified by the first scene of the zombie eating someone in the hallway, or when the dogs burst through the windows. I was hooked. Since that game, Resident Evil has been a big part of my gaming life, but the history of Resident Evil is nothing less than a crazy roller coaster. So today, we're gonna cover every game in the Resident Evil franchise. We'll save the movies for another time. This is the rise and fall and resurrection of Resident Evil.
Welcome to the family, son.
As we mentioned before, in 1993, Shinji Mikami began production on what would become the first Resident Evil game. The goal was to be a spiritual successor of Sweet Home, with the director of Sweet Home and the producer of Resident Evil, Tokuro Fujiwara, saying, "The basic premise was that I'd be able to do the things that I wasn't able to include in Sweet Home." Sweet Home wasn't the only inspiration for the game. During early development, the team's plan to render the full game in polygons ran into issues with the limitations of the PlayStation's hardware. So, the team turned to another horror game, Alone in the Dark. This led them to choosing pre-rendered backgrounds and just letting the characters be rendered in 3D. But there was one piece of inspiration that Mikami credits as what drove him to make this zombie story: the 1979 Italian movie, Zombie. It just maybe wasn't for the reasons you think. In an interview with GamePro, Mikami said, "When I saw the movie, I was dissatisfied with some of the plot twists and action sequences. I thought, if I was making the movie, I'd do this or that differently." In 1996, 3 years after development started, Resident Evil was released, the first game to be dubbed survival horror. Resident Evil follows the Alpha team of Raccoon City Special Tactics and Rescue Services, or STARS. The team's mission was to investigate the whereabouts of Bravo team that went silent investigating a string of cannibalistic murders in Arklay Forest. Alpha team was able to find their crashed helicopter, but were suddenly attacked by a pack of feral dogs. In order to stay alive, the team takes shelter in a seemingly abandoned mansion. All of this is done with a wonderfully campy live-action cutscene. It should be said that basically all of the acting in this game is something.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
Resident Evil plays out differently depending on which character the player chooses to play as, Chris Redfield or Jill Valentine. Each character's story varies slightly, with different characters being in different areas, scenarios playing out differently, and game mechanics being slightly different. Mostly just differences in health, inventory space, and item locations. Both stories then have two different endings depending on the actions you take in the game. The core gameplay of Resident Evil remains the same no matter which character you choose, and lays down the foundation for every future game. Inventory management is a key mechanic in the game, as you'll be juggling scarce resources and limited inventory space. It forces the player to make difficult decisions based on their current situation. For example, leaving ammo behind to take precious healing items. It's a perfect system for a horror game where you need to create tension mechanically. Another big component of Resident Evil is puzzles. The manor itself is filled with puzzles that would require the player to explore every nook and cranny for the pieces you need to progress through the manor. Finding keys, reordering books, adjusting weather vanes, this forces players to thoroughly explore the mansion, which leads to more encounters that the player must either confront or find a way around. But that's just the survival in survival horror. When it comes to horror, Resident Evil did a lot with a little. Due to the limitations, Resident Evil worked with a fixed camera, which ended up being a far greater strength than expected. The limited vision the players had allowed the developers to hide enemies around every corner. Even a long corridor wasn't safe. Still to this day, I'll always remember this scene with the dogs breaking through the window. I swear, it gets me every time. Resident Evil would redefine how horror games were done and, as I mentioned, become the first to be dubbed as survival horror. Its item management system forced players who were used to action games to stop and really think about their choices. You needed to make sure you utilized every slot in your inventory the right way, or it would spell doom. You would have to choose to avoid a fight in order to save bullets for another. Every single shot mattered. That's what made the game stand out above others in the horror genre. Its reception was overwhelmingly positive, with outlets like GameSpot saying that Resident Evil was one of those rare games that's almost as entertaining to watch as it is to play, which speaks directly to Mikami's vision. I want Resident Evil to give the player the feeling that he's the main character in a horror movie. The game quickly became one of the best-selling PlayStation games shortly after it was released, blowing Mikami and Fujiwara's expectations away. The game sold millions of copies worldwide, and it was clear to Capcom that a sequel was needed. Shortly after the release of Resident Evil, development on the sequel would begin. This time around, Mikami would move to a producer role, as Hideki Kamiya, planner on the original game, would take on the role of director. The goal was to build upon that original feeling of fear they were able to achieve with the first game, but make it bigger. Mikami would say in an interview, "As for Resident Evil, there were maybe only 3 or 4 zombies at any time. For Resident Evil 2, there will be around 7 or more. We want to have the sensation of terror as the monsters swarm around the character." As for the story though, the first build, that would be later dubbed as Resident Evil 1.5, had completely new characters with only Raccoon City as a connector. However, production wasn't so smooth. Throughout the development of RE 1.5, Mikami and Kamiya would frequently clash over creative choices. For the sake of the project, Mikami took a more hands-off approach, only asking for a monthly build of the game to check out. But 3 months after taking a back seat to the project, Mikami would come to a devastating conclusion. The ingredients were quite good, so I imagined if we put them in a pot, the rest would be up to how we cooked it. When I opened the lid and tasted it though, it was so bad I turned pale. After seeing that version of 1.5, Mikami had the team scrap everything and start from scratch, delaying the game that was supposed to be released in 1997 to 1998. When everything was scrapped, rewriting the story proved to be a problem, especially with supervisor Yoshiki Okamoto requesting to turn RE into a universe. Enter Noboru Sugimura, a professional screenwriter. Sugimura was brought in to consult on the game with Mikami. The two seemed to hit it off well, with Okamoto saying in an interview, "With Mikami and Sugimura-san, they can have a lively exchange of ideas with each other on equal footing." And with a new story and new direction, the team got to work on what would finally be Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil 2 takes place 2 months after the events of the original game, when most of the population of Raccoon City was infected by the T-virus. In this game, you'll either play as Leon Kennedy, an RPD officer on his first day, or Claire Redfield, a college student looking for her brother Chris from the original game. Each manages to find their way to the Raccoon City police station, where they find themselves slowly pulled into an Umbrella Corp conspiracy. Resident Evil 2 does something incredibly unique in its storytelling. Building off of the characters' specific narratives of the original game, RE2 forces the player to play as both characters in what would be called the zapping system. Players would choose their first character for scenario A, and then players would play as the other character in scenario B. So if you chose Leon in the beginning, you'd play through Leon A and then swap over to Claire B. More so, decisions made in scenario A would affect scenario B. This created high replayability as you would experiment with actions in A to see how it would affect B, whether it's just to see how the story changes or to find the optimal way to beat the game. The gameplay maintains the fixed camera angles, which continues to create tension and fear as you explore the police station. Only now it's amplified with additional zombies that could be on screen, making it feel like you could be overwhelmed at any moment. But that wasn't all that was added. New monsters were added into the game, but truly one of the most iconic new additions is the Tyrant, a stupidly powerful enemy that will hunt the player throughout scenario B. After certain events in the game, the Tyrant would attack the player with the only real option being run. Run, run, run. It ended up being a perfect addition, as now players felt an extra layer of tension as any moment could bring this nearly indestructible enemy into play. Resident Evil 2 was another instant success for Capcom, with incredible reviews across the board. Most of those scores hit higher than the original, with Game Informer giving RE1 a 9 out of 10 and RE2 a 9.5 out of 10. Sure, 0.5 isn't a whole lot, but when you get to the top, That's big. EGM would say of the game, if any software developer wants to see how a sequel should be done, they should look at this game. I, for one, adored Resident Evil 2. I mean, this was the first time we met Leon, and he's one of my favorite characters in gaming, period. And the liquor, my god, when he's crawling on the ceiling in that hallway and drops down, my 9-year-old self had nightmares for weeks. The game would become one of the fastest selling PlayStation games in North America. After only 1.5 months, the game had sold 3 million copies worldwide, absolutely destroying the original game's sales. Resident Evil 2 would become one of the greatest PlayStation games of all time, often finding its way on top 100 games of all time listicles across multiple publications. Resident Evil had cemented itself as a gaming icon, and Capcom was ready to ride that wave as long as they could.
Resident Evil.
By 1998, Resident Evil had become one of Capcom's biggest franchises. With 2 absolute hits, Resident Evil's rise was at light speed. After the release of Resident Evil 2, Capcom decided to go hard on new Resident Evil games. The company would launch development on multiple new Resident Evil games that would include not just Resident Evil 3, but RE Code Veronica and RE4. But let's start with the third installment. Resident Evil 3 was once again being headed up with Mikami as the producer and Kamiya as the director. The initial pitch was for the game to take place on a cruise ship where Hunk, an in-game organization, was trying to bring back a G-Virus sample. As they began to put things together, they realized that it would take far too long to develop. With the PlayStation 2 on the horizon, the team would be finishing it too late for it to be a PS1 game, but we're too far along to smoothly transition to the new hardware. So, the project was scrapped. Rather than have Kamiya try to put something together quicker, he and his team moved on to develop Resident Evil 4. But Capcom wasn't happy with having fans waiting for a new entry into the franchise. They needed something to launch before the PS2's launch. Fortunately for Capcom, they had started multiple spin-offs. After reviewing what they had, they decided to promote a spin-off being led by director Kazuhiro Aoyama to become the next numbered entry in the series, something that the team was affectionately calling Resident Evil 1.5, for real this time though, as it took place between Resident Evil 1 and 2. While the original game was going to follow a new protagonist escaping from Raccoon City, the higher-ups at Capcom had the team change the protagonist to Jill Valentine and have it take place alongside the events of Resident Evil 2. More so, the decision was made for Raccoon City to be completely destroyed, with scenario writer Yasuhisa Kawamura saying, "You could say that in a sense, the launch of the PlayStation 2 ended up taking the lives of 100,000 Raccoon City citizens," which, what a quote. These decisions would lead to what we now know today as Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Resident Evil 3 follows the story of Jill Valentine as she tries to escape the zombie-infested Raccoon City. While trying to find her way out, she comes face to face with a biological weapon created by Umbrella to kill Jill's fellow team members that knew of Umbrella's experiments. It is then up to Jill to find their way out of Raccoon City and put a stop to the weapon known as Nemesis. RE3 is the first game in the franchise where the player has no option as to what character they play as. Instead, the zapping system from RE2 has been changed to the live selection system, still wanting to maintain the idea that your choices can affect the story. During certain cutscenes, you'll need to make a decision to continue forward. And if you're yelling at your screen, "That's just a quick time event," you're not entirely wrong, but these events are much more than just pass or fail. These decisions change the story, where you might meet characters, how scenarios play out, whether or not you take damage from indecision. These moments shape how your story plays out. Mechanically, the game plays very similar to its predecessors. Fixed camera angle, limited inventory space, and enemies around every turn. This time though, Nemesis functions similar to the Tyrant. He will appear multiple times throughout the story to attack the player. The player can fight him, but the best case scenario is that you stall him temporarily. But what really enhances the experience in this game is how they reworked the enemy AI. Enemies, including Nemesis, are far more hunter-like in this game. Where in 1 and 2, the enemies would eventually stop chasing the player after a certain point, in RE3, enemies will chase down Jill much further and even linger outside of save rooms waiting. This is by design, with Mikami telling official UK PlayStation magazine, "I wanted to introduce a new kind of fear into the game. When it disappears after the first confrontation, you live in constant dread of the next attack. The idea is to make you feel like you're being stalked." I love this mechanic, just opening the next door and hearing those damn footsteps and the infamous stars coming out of the Nemesis mouth. I was probably 10 when I was playing this for the first time, and it induced sheer terror every single time. Resident Evil 3 was released to, once again, high critical acclaim. Many outlets rated it incredibly high on their scales, with official UK PlayStation magazine calling it a modern-day classic. Less than a month after the release, it had sold more than 1 million units worldwide. Capcom and Mikami had done it again. The game was another massive hit, setting the stage for the next generation of consoles. Now, as I mentioned before, Capcom had started development on multiple different spin-offs alongside the next two main entries to the franchise. So let's take a moment to talk about the games that came out between Resident Evil 3 and the next main entry. Resident Evil Survivor is a light gun shooter released on the PlayStation in the year 2000. The game takes place shortly after the events of Resident Evil 2 and 3. You play as a helicopter pilot that suffers from amnesia after crash landing on Sheena Island. The game can be played with two different controllers, but the gameplay is the same. If you've been to an arcade and played any game with a gun controller, you understand the mechanic. Use the controller to aim and shoot down enemies. Unlike the arcade shooters though, the players will navigate their way through the island on their own terms, so if you're using a light gun, it's a bit trickier to navigate. Controller, much less so. The game came out to not so great reviews. This would be the first game released with the Resident Evil name that would receive bad reviews. GamePro would say of the game, "Don't be fooled by this one, take Resident Evil out of the title, and all you have left is a below average corridor shooter. The scariest thing about this game is how awful it is. Yikes." But that's just one spin-off. The same year, dropping for the new generation of consoles, was Resident Evil Code Veronica. To be honest, this game feels much more like a mainline entry than anything. The game originally was the result of a failed Sega Saturn port of Resident Evil 2. In an effort to still create something for Sega fans, Mikami was tasked with creating a new game specifically for the platform. But it wasn't long before the Dreamcast was announced, and after internal delays, the game shifted gears for the next generation. A lot was able to change with the advanced power of the next generation. No longer were backgrounds needing to be pre-rendered. Now, every single room could be built completely in 3D, which allowed the game to include dynamic camera moves while moving around the room. This small change brought a whole new life to the series and showed exactly what Resident Evil could be in this new console generation. Just about everything saw a glow up, with better looking models, better voice acting, incredible environments, and terrifying monsters. This is one of my personal favorite games in the franchise. The setting of Rockford Island was great, and the later parts where you finally infiltrate the underground research lab via submarine was a great payoff. But honestly, I think the main reason I look back on this game so fondly was because it was my first Dreamcast game, and Dreamcast is probably one of my favorite consoles of all time. The game released to incredible reviews, quickly bouncing back after the missteps of Survivor, with high scores from basically every single publication. Next Generation would call it the best game yet for Dreamcast. In fact, one of the best games we've seen in the past couple of years. That same sentiment was felt internally in Capcom, with Mikami saying that it deserved to have been numbered more than Resident Evil 3. The only reason it didn't was for political reasons between Capcom and the console manufacturing company. The next year, Capcom would release the second game in the Survivor series, also called Code Veronica. Just as Code Veronica was made to satisfy Sega fans, Survivor Code Veronica was built in partnership with Namco to create arcade games using the Resident Evil franchise. Since the Dreamcast shared similar hardware to the Sega Naomi arcade board, it made a lot of sense to reuse assets from Code Veronica to make the light gun shooter. The arcade version was actually a big success in Japan, with Game Machine magazine listing it as one of the most successful dedicated arcade games in August. The PlayStation 2 port, however, did not have as much success, with its current Metacritic score being 4.3. Needless to say, the port over to the console did not translate well. Then there was the Game Boy Color game Resident Evil Gaiden, developed by a third-party developer, M4. Not a lot is known about the development of this game, but the story points to some interesting lore. Ari Gaiden takes place place on a cruise ship named the Starlight, a very similar premise to the original plan for RE3, though at this time there was no way to confirm if that old scenario was reused. The game took the place of a ported version of the original Resident Evil and featured gameplay that felt more like an RPG than it did survival horror. Yes, all of the aspects of the RE series were there, limited items and tons of zombies. However, in order to make the game work on the portable system, combat would take place in separate battle screens where the player would need to time their shots to deal the maximum amount of damage. It was a unique way of handling it, and you have to applaud them for trying to keep the tension of battle on a system that couldn't handle the original mechanics. The game came out to mixed reviews, with IGN tearing through it, calling it slow and boring. I totally respect M4 for trying its hand at the license, but the game design just doesn't work. It's not fun. While it felt like a valiant attempt, the system they chose to go with ended up being the problem, especially with the Game Boy Advance just around the corner. In 2002, Mikami would return to the director's seat to develop the remake of his original game, Resident Evil. Something we haven't talked about is the amount of ports that Resident Evil saw over the years. All three original games would find their way onto Nintendo and Sega platforms, as well as PC ports. As part of an agreement with Nintendo, Capcom was going to bring RE1, 2, 3, and Code Veronica to the GameCube. RE2, 3, and Code Veronica would simply be ported over to the new console, but Mikami decided that he wanted to remake the original Resident Evil. A quote from NGC magazine says, Mikami said that the reason he set about revisiting and revamping the original mansion was so he could exploit the GameCube's power in order to bring the Resident Evil franchise closer to his original vision. And so they began work on the Resident Evil remake with the goal of making vast improvements to the graphics and gameplay. Initially, just like the original, they intended on making the environment of the mansion fully 3D. But once again, in order to achieve the true look and feel they wanted, the team opted for fully pre-rendered backgrounds, choosing to focus the processing power on the characters and enemies. To make up for this choice, designers used high contrast to create even more ways to hide enemies. As for gameplay, Mikami wanted to make sure that players who enjoyed the original would still have new experiences when playing the remake. The team made some quality of life changes to the inventory system and added new weapons to diversify combat. With new weapons, the team then had to rebalance the enemies with those new weapons in mind. This also included a new enemy type with the Crimson Heads, which would come back after being killed. And gameplay isn't the only thing they wanted to overhaul. The original script was reworked and rewritten to help with, well, you know.
Jill Sandwich.
The tone of the script was more serious, and new voice actors were brought to update their performances. When it was released, the remake received critical acclaim across the board with incredible scores with every major publication. GameSpot said of the game, Capcom has fused the best of both worlds together into one amazing game that clearly stands as the best the series has to offer. While there was plenty of criticism of the tank controls, the game was clearly another enormous hit. Yet again. It was clear that Capcom saw the incredible potential of the series and was testing the waters to see where they could take the franchise. Sure, there were some missteps with games built around arcade machines and portable consoles, but Code Veronica and the Resident Evil remake showed that the audience was still hungry for more. Everyone loved Resident Evil, so it was time for Capcom to drop the next numbered game.
Resident Evil 0.
Rewinding back to 1996, while Mikami was working on the original game, the idea of a prequel was being floated around. Then, when Capcom began their development sprint after RE2, one of those games was that very prequel originally being developed for the N64. But, like many Resident Evils before it, the idea was far more ambitious, and it was clear that the game was not going to fit on the N64 cartridge. So, the decision was made to move the game to the newly released GameCube. While the concept and story could stay intact, the rest had to be rebuilt. The team would rework everything they'd done before, but also expand on a lot of elements, like more cinematics to enhance the story. On November 12, 2002, Resident Evil 0 would find its way onto store shelves. RE0 takes place a day before the events of the original game. Rebecca Chambers was part of the Bravo team of stars that was sent to look into the cannibalistic murders in the Arclay Forest, but like we learned from the first game, Bravo team's helicopter crash landed in the forest. With their helicopter out of commission, Rebecca stumbles across a stalled train. That is where she finds that the train's passengers have all been turned into zombies. Now it's up to her and convicted felon Billy Cohen to fight off the zombies and put a stop to the source. The gameplay follows the same formula that we've seen in the previous games with the improvements of the recent ones. Cameras are once again fixed with some movement to enhance things like the train moving. The train has incredibly tight corridors, adding to the claustrophobia, and though it is only a section of the game keeps up that trend as you move from place to place. As always, there are limited resources, but there was one interesting twist on the inventory system. Players did not have access to an item box where they could store extra items. Instead, any item dropped would show up on your map so you can go back and find it if you need it. New to this specific game is character zapping, which allows the players to switch between Rebecca and Billy at any time though. If the two were ever headed the same way, the character not being played would have AI that would fight off enemies. To make sure you are utilizing both characters, both protagonists would have unique skills. Rebecca was able to mix items together, while Billy was able to move heavy objects. They also had different defensive stats, making it imperative that you keep Rebecca safer than Billy. The game would follow the footsteps with Code Veronica, showing how the new generation of consoles could enhance the gameplay and horror elements with the higher detail in the graphics. The critics tended to agree. The game was received positively, but not as high as the other previously numbered games. While the game was praised for its horror elements, the control scheme that Resident Evil had been using for years now was starting to show its age. The tank-style controls had been abandoned for some time now in 3D games, with RE being one of the few franchises still using it. But that was all about to change. But first, more spin-offs. Resident Evil Dead Aim brought the franchise back to the light gun shooter genre, which, yes, I can already hear you groaning, but this time around, instead of being in full first person, the game would have you explore and move in third person, but switch to first person for combat. While at the time this may have felt like a unique combination of the two, looking at it now, it feels a bit clunky as you switch back and forth. The game itself takes place 4 years after Resident Evil 2 and has the player taking control of Bruce McGivern and Fong Ling as they fight through a T-virus infested ocean liner, Spencer Rain. The two are there to stop a bioterrorist, Morpheus D. Duval, from launching T-virus missiles at the US and China. If this seems familiar, it's because it's a similar premise to Resident Evil Gaiden, which was originally the story for Resident Evil 3. Well, supposedly. The game came out to mixed reviews, with a lot of scores being right down the middle. While most outlets call this one the best out of the light gun games, IGN would criticize it for not doing much for the series. If you're a diehard fan of the series, there isn't a lot to be discovered here in terms of adding to the franchise's mythology, and the characters themselves are a little cut and dry. But now it was time for Capcom to take a stab at a Resident Evil online game. While online gaming was still in its infancy around the time, especially for PlayStation 2, Capcom wanted to take a stab at a game focused on online multiplayer. In 2002, Capcom announced they were working on 3 games focused on online play: Auto Modelista, Monster Hunter, and Resident Evil Outbreak. Outbreak was being built as an episodic cooperative game similar to what Left 4 Dead would become years later. While developing Outbreak, the team wrote multiple different episodes, with only 5 making it, and 5 more would be used in the making of the standalone expansion, Outbreak File 2. Both Outbreak and Outbreak File 2 played similarly. Players would select the scenario they wanted to play, the difficulty, and then what character they wanted to play as. Each character would have their own unique abilities to help the team survive the scenario. Rather than use microphones to communicate, the game had an in-game communication system dubbed the ad-lib system. This forced the player to communicate using a predetermined list of words to write out messages. They chose this over a standard microphone to keep the immersion intact, thinking that mics would take away from Resident Evil's atmosphere. Outbreak and Outbreak File 2 take place days after the initial outbreak of the T-virus in Raccoon City. Players could choose between 8 different playable characters: Kevin Ryman, David King, Mark Wilkins, Cindy Lennox, Yoko Suzuki, Jim Chapman, George Hamilton, and Alyssa Ashcroft, whose name should be familiar in, say, an upcoming entry into the franchise. It is then up to the group to survive each scenario as they search for a way to escape from Raccoon City. RE Outbreak, while a unique take on online multiplayer, came out to mixed reviews. While it did average on the higher side, its successor, Outbreak File 2, did worse. While the first game would go on to sell nearly 1.5 million copies, Outbreak File 2 ended up grossly underselling. Outbreak Remake 2 would be the last in the series, and once again, Capcom found that spinning off was risky. Fortunately for Capcom, they made Devil May Cry. Sorry, one more thing before we move on to peak Resident Evil. When Kamiya switched gears to developing for the new generation for what was supposed to be Resident Evil 4, an interesting thing happened. Kamiya and Sugimura came up with an idea revolving around a character with superhuman powers thanks to biotechnology. The idea was to be more action-adventure based, but when they tried to shove that into the Resident Evil format, Mikami realized that it just didn't work. According to an interview with IGN, Mikami spent months trying to convince the higher-ups that it needed to be a new title. When they finally agreed, Kamiya and his team were able to let loose and create another franchise I love, Devil May Cry. But with the groundwork of what was supposed to be Resident Evil 4 gone, the team needed to come up with a new plan. And what they created is nothing less than a masterpiece.
Resident Evil 4.
At the end of 2001, development for Resident Evil 4 was back at square one. Since Kamiya was now working on Devil May Cry, Hiroshi Shibata, part of the development team of RE3, was brought back on to direct the next sequel. During this time, Resident Evil 4 would go through various versions, but two major versions stood out: Fog version and Hooked Man version. The Fog version would be announced in November 2002, when it was about 40% complete. This version would feature Leon Kennedy infiltrating an Umbrella HQ fighting the traditional RE zombies. He would then get infected with the progenitor virus, and the players would have to deal with the worsening symptoms. This version would be scrapped. The next version would be the Hooked Man version. This version saw Leon fighting off a mysterious disease that would cause his sanity to fall apart. As his sanity lowers, he would fight off more supernatural enemies, including an enemy built around the idea of Nemesis. This monster would be called the Hooked Man by the fandom, hence the name. This version, though, would also be scrapped. Now, afterwards, there would be a few other iterations of the hallucination idea, but nothing ever really landed. It was clear that Resident Evil needed something different to push the series forward. That's when Mikami took over the director role. The man who started this whole franchise was now back at the wheel. At this point in time, the franchise was starting to feel dull. After Resident Evil 0, it was clear that things were starting to feel a little too similar. According to producer Hiroyuki Kobayashi, in the past installments, we were stuck in the cookie-cutter RE mold. We had to break those shackles holding us down before we came up with something new. Mikami set out to do just that by having the team rework how the game looked, from cameras to how the characters were built. But perhaps one of the biggest changes, though, would be a shift to a more action-based gameplay style. Kobayashi said this in an interview with the German publication Endzone. It was not easy to keep the team going after we changed the direction of the game so radically. When it was decided to make the game more action-oriented, the team felt really depressed. It would require Mikami to come in and directly intervene and write a brand new story in only 3 weeks to help work in this new version of the game. Once the team saw the new vision, the team was reinvigorated and got to work on the changes. This huge departure from the original format called into question whether this would work as a Resident Evil game. The gameplay felt completely different, and the new story was the first RE to not incorporate Umbrella. Even Mikami was nervous, saying the only time he actually felt nervous about the game was trying out the new systems. But what ended up being released was truly something special. Resident Evil 4 follows Leon S. Kennedy on a mission to save the president's daughter, Ashley Graham. Ashley had been kidnapped by the cult Los Illuminados, who had used the parasite Las Plagas to control the rural town near their HQ. When Leon arrives, he is captured by Torres Mendez, chief of the cult, who injects Leon with the parasite. It's now a race against time as Leon must save Ashley, who has also been infected, and find a way to remove the parasite before they fall under Los Illuminados' control. Similar to Resident Evil 3, players had no choice but to play as Leon, but unlike 3, the game has been massively overhauled. While the scarcity of items remains, the game now has more of a combat focus, and the camera has been moved from a fixed angle to an over-the-shoulder third-person angle. This significantly changed how the horror is delivered. In order to maintain the horror aspect of the series, enemies come in far more numbers, and enemies like like the regenerator, require quick precision in order to avoid damage. Man, using the thermal scope to identify where the weak points on the regenerators were, which by the way were their multiple hearts, was just so cool. I love this game from top to bottom. It's an absolute classic. I am not the only one that thinks that too. Reception for this game was overwhelmingly very positive and was widely seen as one of the best games of all time. The PS2 and GameCube versions stand at an insane 96 out of 100 critic score, and to this day stands at 9 out of 10 user score on Metacritic. IGN had enormous praise for the game. I had some pretty high expectations for Resident Evil 4, and to my complete surprise, the title actually exceeded them. This is simply the best survival horror game ever created. Mikami had successfully redefined what Resident Evil was. At its core, it was always survival horror, but RE4 made it something different. This stood out as a major landmark for the series. Resident Evil was at its peak, but unfortunately, once you're at the top, all there is to do is go down. A year after the release of Resident Evil 4, Capcom would release Resident Evil Deadly Silence. This DS port of the original Resident Evil was made to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the game and included two modes, Classic and Rebirth. Classic mode stayed as close as it could to the original with some minimal quality of life changes. Rebirth mode would simply include more enemies, new mechanics, and new puzzles. It also included multiplayer that included a cooperative mode where you could attempt to leave the mansion and a competitive mode in which players compete for the highest score. There's not much more to say here other than, hey, look, another Resident Evil remake, but for a DS game, it was the first of only 11 games to get a mature rating. For Nintendo, this was a big deal, and it was the first time that the Resident Evil franchise was able to truly bring the horror elements it was known for to the handheld market. That in itself made this particular port of the game notable. And then they went and made yet another light gun shooter. This time though, specifically designed for Wii. The game was originally supposed to be a Wii version of Resident Evil 4, but the game's director, Masachika Kawada, changed directions. Wii users like easiness. We want players to enjoy the game's horrifying and creepy world and its thrilling shooting action, and by reducing enthusiast-only elements, players can purely enjoy the world. Unlike the previous light gun shooters though, this game was a true on-the-rails shooter. No longer were you swapping from third person to first person or moving around. The game moved you around and you pulled the trigger. This did help with the horror elements of the game as you couldn't control the camera and look around, letting you get surprised with every turn. However, in this game, you really start to see the action genre start to creep in as a stronger element. With the emphasis on gunplay, the game doesn't really build up the atmosphere as much. Not to mention that most areas feel more like big action set pieces rather than the survival horror aspects taking priority. The game itself retells a lot of the stories from Resident Evil 0, 1, and 3, with some changes and some original stories towards the end of the game. That original content shines some light on some gaps in the story, such as Wesker's revival after he was presumably killed at the end of Resident Evil 1. The final scenario would show Wesker finally taking down Umbrella and exposing everything it was doing. Overall, the game was released to moderately positive reviews with scores averaging around the 70% mark. Most outlets said they enjoyed the gameplay, but there was something off, whether it was the music or lack of highlighting stories from two of its biggest games, RE2 and 4. Personally, I think there are just some things that undercut the horror aspects. The on-rails aspect did add a level of tension since you didn't have control, but something about it felt far too action-based for a Resident Evil game. Little did we all know, this was just a precursor to the breakdown of what makes a Resident Evil game. The year is 2009 and action shooters were on the rise. With the massive success of Modern Warfare, Gears of War, and Battlefield, games really began shifting to gritty, realistic first-person shooters. In March of that year, Resident Evil would take its first major fall. Resident Evil 5 was announced on July 20th, 2005 and was produced by Jun Takeuchi, who directed Onimusha Warlords and produced Lost Planet Extreme Condition, and directed by Yasuhiro Anpo, who was programmer on the original Resident Evil. Takeuchi has gone on record stating that two major influences on this game were Black Hawk Down and Takeuchi's previous game, Lost Planet. The story takes place 5 years after the events of Resident Evil 4. Chris has joined the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance and was sent to stop the selling of a BOW, or bioorganic weapon. When Chris and his new partner Shiva arrive in Kijuju, West Africa, they find that the population has been infected with Las Plagas and a new strain called Ouroboros. When Chris sees a picture of his old partner Jill, Chris and Shiva find themselves wrapped up in a far bigger conspiracy than just one BOW. This plot, while seemingly pretty straightforward, would end up getting the team in hot water. The game was accused of depicting classic racist imagery. This video isn't here to address the validity of those claims, and we're definitely not going to dive any further into this, but the important takeaway here is the fact that this game, even before the launch, was already having issues, but it was the core issues in the gameplay that started to put off the fanbase. RE5 was set to use the same basic mechanics of RE4, the over-the-shoulder camera, but with more of an emphasis on action. However, the team behind the new entry wanted to develop the game a little differently. The core mechanic of RE5 is co-op. That's right, the game itself was built from the bottom up, with co-op gameplay being a core mechanic of this game. One player would control Chris, looking much more rugged than his previous iteration, and the second player would control the new character, Shiva. If there wasn't a second player, Shiva would be controlled by AI and could be ordered to pick up items and swap weapons. Resident Evil has never been a stranger to a partner character, but in this one, the partner is a key piece to gameplay. So, if you didn't have a friend to play, you were relying on AI that may or may not have been helpful. Myself, I played through it with my friend Andrew, and while it was fun to play, there was just something off about this one. That problem was identity. Up until 2009, Resident Evil had always been a survival horror series. The main games in the series had always had limited inventory, forcing you to play smart, and the atmosphere of the games was dripping with dread and uneasiness. When these two fused together, every encounter felt tense, and your skill was the only thing that would get you through this. RE5 seemed to kind of forget all of that. Just like the creeping issues we started to see in Umbrella Chronicles, everything started to feel like big action set pieces rather than tense, horrifying encounters. Monster reveals felt more like they were intros to new demons you'd see in a Doom 2016 game. Cinematics lost that tense flair and tended to showcase action. Chris punched a boulder. He punches a boulder in a fight that takes place at the top of a volcano. The whole game felt like it forgot what it was supposed to be. It was as if the pieces were there, but the execution felt much more like you were playing a game of Left 4 Dead than a Resident Evil game. Reviews on the game were still somewhat positive though, with scores similar to that of Umbrella Chronicles, which for a numbered Resident Evil game was shocking. Many critics noted the loss of identity and the shift to a more action game. And in a sea of just first-person gritty shooters, well, it felt like a drop in the bucket. It just didn't feel like Resident Evil, but unfortunately, things were only going to fall even further. Lead up to the next numbered entry into the series was, you guessed it, a series of spin-off games. Starting with a follow-up to Umbrella Chronicles, Darkside Chronicles. This entry covers the stories that Umbrella Chronicles didn't. Well, sort of. The game includes scenarios that retell the events of Resident Evil 2 and Code Veronica, and two new scenarios including a story of Leon's first mission with the US Special Operations Command. Beyond that, the game played very similar to Umbrella Chronicles. Rail shooter using the Wiimote to fight your way through hordes of zombies and mutants. However, Dark Chronicles does a lot to improve on what Umbrella did. First, the atmosphere is much better than the previous game. The game feels tense and music doesn't pull away from the horror parts of the game. But then there was the camera. The camera is bad. The intention was to make it feel more like you were seeing the world through the character's eyes, but it's just way too wobbly here. I feel sick just looking at it. Still, the game received fairly positive reviews and maybe instilled some hope for us RE fans. Next up was Resident Evil Mercenaries 3D. We really haven't talked much about the Mercenary mode, so let's take a moment to quickly cover it. Mercenary mode was an extra mode that was introduced in Resident Evil 3 Nemesis that was more arcade-like. Players would take on the mantle of a mercenary and would need to explore the destroyed Raccoon City to save civilians and kill enemies. All of that fighting to get your paycheck. It was a simple mode that would be built out over the years across RE4, 5, 6, and later 8, but it would be a main focus with the Nintendo 3DS game Mercenaries 3D. Resident Evil Mercenaries 3D was an expanded version of the mini-games found in the previous games, as in they took mercenary modes from Resident Evil 4 and 5 and shoved them into one standalone game. The game feels very similar to RE5, with elements like the UI and characters looking like they were taken straight out of the previous title. It plays very similarly too, with far more action in this game, with things like finishers where your character performs a finishing blow like an action star, just blowing past enemies. The thing is, as a standalone game, there just isn't much going on here. For a handheld game, this made a lot of sense to jump in and out of missions, but that's it. It doesn't add much to the franchise, and the reviews reflect that, with most scores hitting at around 60%, with many outlets stating that it just didn't have the content to be worth the purchase, especially when Resident Evil Revelations was released just 1 year later. Resident Evil Revelations takes place shortly after the events of Resident Evil 4. The story follows Jill as she and fellow BSAA agent Parker find themselves on a rescue mission to save Chris and his partner Jessica. The pair had gone dark, and it was up to Jill to board the Queen Zenobia to save them. That's right, we're on a cruise ship again, and it just feels weird for it to happen 3 times throughout Resident Evil, but I digress. Revelations was also released on the 3DS and was able to do something that Mercenaries couldn't: bring back the horror atmosphere. The idea was, with the power of Nintendo's 3D tech, they could create a more terrifying experience that recaptures the tension of looking around every corner. To a degree, they do a great job with it. The tight corridors of the ship make it hard to tell what's coming up, and switching on 3D mode just adds a level of literal depth you couldn't get from other consoles at the time. Sure, there were still action sequences and melee attacks that felt right out of an action game though, but overall it managed to put the game back in that darker horror feel that Resident Evil built itself on. Reviews for the game were mostly positive, with a lot of outlets praising the game for its environments and atmosphere. But then Operation Raccoon City took the franchise back to a shooter action game. Released for PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Windows, Operation Raccoon City was a squad-based shooter where you take control of agents from either the Umbrella Security Service or the US Special Ops team. The game itself takes place during the events of Resident Evil 2 and 3, which at this point feel like they've been covered to death with this franchise. The game itself is a third-person cover shooter where you and a squad of mediocre AI team members fight your way through the Raccoon City incident, and that's really it. It really just feels like another shooter with a coat of Resident Evil paint thrown on top of it for good measure. Nothing really about it feels very Resident Evil-y. It's action, it's fast-paced, it's just a product of the time, really. The game came out to really mixed reviews across the board. Many outlets commented on how bad the design was and how cookie-cutter it was as a shooter, with even IGN stating, "In the end, Operation Raccoon City is little more than a poor man's SOCOM and a destitute man's Resident Evil." It was another huge misstep for the franchise, but it was about to get way worse. Resident Evil 6 is a mess. Just a big old mess. Around this time, indie horror was really starting to take off, with games like Slender, The 8 Pages, Amnesia, and heck, even AAA horror games like Dead Space redefining what a horror game could be for this generation. Resident Evil needed to step up with something big to compete. The strategy? An episodic horror game with each episode focusing on a different type of horror. Producer Yoshiaki Hirabayashi said, "With Leon, we have that gothic, classic Resident Evil style horror. With Chris, it's more like a horror of the battlefield with his group. With Jake's campaign, he's being chased by this creature and being stalked. And with Ada's, it's more of a very classic Resident Evil style single player experience." Resident Evil 6 was one of Capcom's biggest undertakings yet, with more than 600 people working on the game. Capcom was looking to make RE6 the franchise's most ambitious game ever, and it was set to be a bold new direction for the franchise. What we got was not that. RE6 is told in 4 different stories, all revolving around the new C virus and Neo Umbrella organization. Each episode would feature one of RE's fan favorite characters: Leon Kennedy, Chris Redfield, Ada Wong, and Jake Moeller. Okay, well, that last one was a new one they created specifically for this game. The episodes would feature loose connections between the stories, and each plays out as different perspectives on the same story, each with a different flavor of horror attached. However, the game did not bring that horror to the table. RE6 is an action shooter through and through. This takes the building blocks of RE5 and just pushes further into action. The game is once again over the shoulder, and sure, there are small moments of puzzles that we saw in the previous games, but the game is just too fast-paced, with big action set pieces again being thrown at the player. And again, we had a big, epic final battle that felt more spectacle than anything. But this time, on rooftops of China. It just feels so grandiose compared to the intimate, close quarters of an underground secret lab like we see in RE2. Whatever part of Resident Evil's survival horror was just simply not there, only holding on to small elements like limited resources and zombies to keep the franchise going. This wasn't lost on critics too. Some publications noted that they enjoyed the game, but noticed that RE wasn't horror anymore. It was truly a game that was just going through the motions to fulfill another RE release rather than doing what Resident Evil 4 did so well all those years ago. Resident Evil felt like it died with RE6. The former powerhouse in the horror genre became just another shooter, but with zombies. The plot was out of control and there just didn't seem like there was a way out. Resident Evil would disappear for 2 years after the release of 6. Shortly after, we'd get a follow-up to Revelations, this time following Claire Redfield and Moira Burton, daughter of Barry Burton. The gameplay was similar to Resident Evil 0, as you would need to switch between the characters to solve puzzles, but added in the co-op features from RE5 where 2 players could play the game together. Similar to RE Revelations, the game does a much better job holding on to that survival horror genre, but the reviews for the game were only kind of positive. It just wasn't enough to pull the franchise out of the damage from RE6. Then, there was Umbrella Corps, a tactical competitive shooter that is widely regarded as the worst Resident Evil game of all time. The game felt like it was trying to capitalize on the online shooter formula, but ultimately it just felt like sloppy Call of Duty with zombies here. It was just not it, and only further destroyed the reputation of the series. Even with Revelations 2 trying to bring the series back, it just wasn't enough. By 2015, the franchise felt like it was slowly dying, as though the franchise that we once loved for its fresh new approach to the horror genre turned its back on everything it had stood for, becoming an empty shell of what we had. Until the year is 2014. A mysterious game arrived on the PlayStation Store simply titled PT Playable Trailer. This game would eventually be revealed to be the newest entry into the Silent Hill franchise. That was promptly canceled. It was devastating for gamers, but that's not what this video is about. Though if you would want me to cover the Silent Hill franchise, considering Silent Hill F is just around the corner, comment Justice for Silent Hills down in the comments below. On your way back, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like for more deep dives like this. Okay, now back to Resident Evil. With the success of PT, gamers saw what a horror game could be with the newest generation of consoles. In February of 2014, development began on what would become Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. The game was produced by Masashika Kawada and Tsuyoshi Kanda and directed by Koshi Nakanishi. According to Jun Takeuchi, the Capcom higher-ups wanted the new game to be a live service game with microtransactions. That was scrapped when Takeuchi joined the team as an executive producer, and the decision was made to go back to Resident Evil's roots, similar to what was done with RE4. The team also turned to another horror movie for inspiration, The Evil Dead. The Evil Dead inspired the team to pull back the scale of the game and keep it to one location. The development team also decided to shift the perspective to first person and add in VR support that was possible with the RE engine. At E3 2015, Capcom released a demo of the game that was simply called Kitchen, with the 7 in Kitchen being the only tie to Resident Evil. Nothing else was said to relate it, but anyone who played it quickly put the pieces together. The demo felt similar to PT with a small area to explore, but jam-packed with scares, and we ate it up. Then in January 2017, Resident Evil 7 was released. RE7 takes place in Dulvey, Louisiana, where Ethan Winters arrives trying to find his missing wife, Mia. Mia had left him a mysterious message 3 years ago, and his investigation finally brought him to a small, rundown plantation in the south. Ethan quickly finds Mia, but when she goes into a violent frenzy, Ethan finds himself trapped in the clutches of the Baker family and the twisted horrors surrounding the family's home. I love this game. Resident Evil 7 was exactly what the franchise needed. The gameplay returns to that feeling Resident Evil was able to capitalize on all those years ago. Resources were incredibly limited, and managing your inventory was a key mechanic to the gameplay. Puzzles felt more prominent as they did in the early games, and the scares. This was first-person horror done right. Every area of the game was expertly crafted to feel uncomfortable, to the point where even being next to a wall felt unsafe. You never knew what you would run into around every corner. Even the mechanic of being stalked returns, with Jack Baker appearing in certain sections to hunt you down, similar to the Tyrant and Nemesis. Cinematics felt less like action movie moments, but instead terrifying moments where you had no control over the situation. Resident Evil was feeling like itself again. Everything that RE6 had done felt like a distant memory. The game also included some of the best DLC I've ever played, with different scenarios highlighting stories only hinted at during the main game. Banned footage features 4 different stories, with 3 of them featuring Clancy, a cameraman who shows up early in the game. The first 3 tapes are various mini-games like a horde mode, an escape room, and a twisted version of blackjack. The final tape details the events leading up to the infection of the Baker family. Then you have Not a Hero, the first of 2 epilogues where you play as Chris Redfield once again as he cleans up the aftermath of the main game. End of Zoe is the final epilogue and DLC where you play as Joe Baker trying to save Zoe Baker from Umbrella and the mold monsters. Every single one of these DLCs feels so full and great to play. All of this together made for an incredibly satisfying entry into the Resident Evil franchise. I remember being a bit skeptical of the change to first person, but man, it was such a great decision and made Resident Evil far more terrifying for me than it ever has been before, which is saying a lot because I've been playing this franchise since the PlayStation 1. Resident Evil 7 had favorable reviews, showing a sign that the game was winning back critics and gamers alike. While the scores are not nearly as high as RE4, the scores mostly averaged out to be in the 8 out of 10 range. PC Gamer would say it's a return to the atmospheric, slow-burning horror of the original. The convoluted mythology, overripe melodrama, and absurd action set pieces that plagued the last few games have been sidelined for something more subtle and refined. Resident Evil was back in a big way. Was it revolutionizing the genre? Not really, but the return to form was so refreshing to see. Little did we know, Capcom had some new plans up their sleeves. Normally, we'd see Capcom experimenting and trying to do anything they can with the franchise during this time between numbered games. However, in 2019, Capcom chose to do something a bit more safe: remakes of the original games. Well, most of them. These remakes, though, were truly something else. First up was the return of Resident Evil 2. There had been talk within Capcom for years on remaking the originals with the new systems and engine the company had developed. In 2015, the team got their wish and began development of the remake of RE2. The game would remain faithful to the original story, and even the zapping system was brought back, with players picking their first character and then switching to the other character. Graphics were, of course, completely overhauled with the fancy new RE engine to be more photorealistic, and the camera was shifted to a third-person over-the-shoulder perspective like we saw in Resident Evil 4. The game plays great, it looks great, it's just great. The original game was already one of the best games in the series, and the remake used all the lessons Capcom had learned over the years to make it the definitive way to play the game. The atmosphere of the police station is beautifully done, and the team was still able to keep the scares coming. Every turn in the game was a new opportunity to surprise the player with the unknown. The game was a certified hit and received universal acclaim from critics. Nearly every publication gave the game some of its highest scoring, hitting in the 9.5 out of 10 range easily. OpenCritic even states in its review summary of the game, Resident Evil 2 is a gold standard for how to do a remake. Combining the original's nostalgia with the modernized and fresh gameplay, this may be the best Resident Evil game ever released. It's such a crazy thing to say that a remake is the best in the franchise, but it truly is that great. Following the success of the RE2 remake, it only made sense that RE3 was next. However, this time around, there were some more significant changes to the story. The RE2 remake did feature some changes to the script of the original, but RE3 made a lot more changes than the original one. Carlos plays a bigger role in the story. Some areas were completely cut, and the alternate endings were removed completely to focus on a single, more honed story. There were also more moments that tied RE3 to RE2, added added in to help enhance the experience of both stories happening at the same time. The game played similar to the RE2 remake with it in third person, but one thing that was changed was a bit more substantial. Nemesis himself. The big guy had his AI changed to be far more aggressive when he appeared. He would start using weapons against the player, utilize his mutations more, and even leap at the player. RE3 was also bundled with a multiplayer online mode called Resistance, which featured 4 survivors going up against one mastermind, similar to, say, Dead by Daylight. It was okay, and critics agreed with a very mediocre score across the board. RE3 itself would get mixed reviews, but it still mostly leaned in the positive direction. Most criticized the game feeling a bit more hollow. A lot of outlets compared it to the excellence of the RE2 remake, which was always going to be a tough spot to be in. The next numbered game would be released in 2021, but I want to jump forward to the last remake that dropped in 2023, Resident Evil 4. RE4 held a special place in a lot of fans' hearts, and remaking this was going to be a big one. They knocked it out of the park. Most of the team from the Resident Evil 2 remake returned to bring this classic into the modern era. The main goal was to take RE4 that started the turn to action back to the horror roots of the franchise. The visuals were greatly changed to create a better horror atmosphere, and a lot of changes were made to how Ashley worked in this version. Instead of falling back or waiting in areas like the original, Ashley would always be with Leon as he fights Las Plagas. The goal was to create a better relationship between Leon and Ashley, so whether you like it or not, she was always close. The story, again, closely follows the events of Resident Evil 4, with some changes to the script to tone down the cheesiness of the original. The game itself plays similar to how it played in the original version, but smoother and better quality of life improvements. The developers also did everyone a favor by reducing the amount of QuickTime events, which I appreciate. I mean, I wish I could remark more on the gameplay other than it's RE4 modernized and it plays great. Critics loved this game, with universal acclaim across nearly every publication. Resident Evil 4 was once again one of the highest reviewed games in the series. The game received more perfect scores from outlets than any other game in the franchise. It was clear that this classic still had a lot more life, and bringing it to the modern era was an easy win for Capcom. But now, let's rewind to...
What in the did you not tell me about Lady Dimitrescu, okay?
After the success of Resident Evil 7, a follow-up was guaranteed to be just around the corner. As a matter of fact, the sequel was already in the works about a half a year before the release of RE7. The development team didn't have feedback from 7 quite yet, but the team moved forward with a simple principle in mind: fuse RE4 and 7 together. While talking to IGN, director Morimasa Soto said, "We're bringing the essence of Resident Evil 4 while Resident Evil 7 functions as the base for the game. It's not a reboot of Resident Evil 4, but the offspring of both Resident Evil 7 and 4, which is funny for him to say that since 2 short years later, Resident Evil 4 Remake would be released. Once they saw that RE7 was a success, the team solidified the plan to make RE8 a direct sequel, with Ethan Winters once again taking up the mantle of protagonist. The game was going to be broken into 4 houses, with the village set as the hub, each with a unique brand of horror. Heisenberg and technological horrors, Moreau and horrific mermen, Beneviento and haunting ghosts. Then finally...
Oh, be careful what you wish for, Ethan Winters.
Are you kidding me? What the
Okay, we should probably talk about this. In early 2021, Capcom released a trailer featuring the towering 9'6" vampire overlord, Lady Dimitrescu. The internet collectively lost their minds. Resident Evil had never received such viral, free marketing in the entire history of their franchise. Lady Dimitrescu would put the franchise front and center on nearly every social platform. All eyes were on RE Village. Now, they just had to deliver. RE8 takes place 3 years after RE7, where Ethan and Mia moved to Europe with their newly born baby, Rosemary. The family lived a quiet, peaceful life until one day, Chris Redfield storms in, kills Mia, and abducts Ethan and Rosemary. The next day, Ethan awakes next to the crashed transport truck he was being moved in. With his baby missing, Ethan stumbles into a small village plagued with lichens. When he is taken to Mother Miranda, he discovers that Miranda and her lords had Rosemary. It's now up to Ethan to fight through each lord's house to save his baby and discover the truth about the village. The game plays very similarly to Resident Evil 7 with a first-person camera and strong survival horror elements, limited inventory, limited resources, and more puzzles to solve in order to progress in the game. However, unlike Resident Evil 7, Village tends to be a bit more focused on combat. There are more enemies that need to be taken out, and there are far more areas that are more open for fights. It does take a bit away from the horror of the game, but not enough to even come close to an issue in my opinion. Heck, House Beneviento is easily one of the scariest parts of the game. Dolls. Lots of dolls is all I'll say. The game also features the return of mercenaries, unlocked by beating the game. This mode serves as a way to unlock perks that could be used on replays of the main game. That's honestly one of the best parts of the game. Village has so much replayability with special guns only accessible through currency you unlock by getting achievements during the main game and mercenary modes. I think I've played through this game multiple times, unlocking all the weapons and ammo cheats to blast through the hardest modes. The game would also include a DLC story that follows a teenage Rosemary looking for a way to remove her powers inherited by her father. Play the main game, it'll make sense, okay? The DLC reuses a lot of the maps and resources from the main game, but are now far more twisted and unsettling to move through. It plays as a great send-off for Ethan, and sets up a path forward for the story. Resident Evil 8 received positive reviews from most publications, and scored around the same as Resident Evil 7. Many publications would comment on how RE7 felt far more horror-oriented than RE8, with some saying that certain sections felt like action moments from RE6. And I'd agree, it's slightly less horror and more action, but man, the characters in this game are so good. I love the upgrade system, the setting is absolutely stunning, and yeah, Resident Evil 8 Village was fantastic. Which now brings us to today, with Resident Evil 9 now on the horizon, which, if I can say, what a cheeky way to reveal the game. Gaslighting us to think they needed more time for an announcement just to drop the trailer at the end of Summer Games Fest? I see you, Capcom. The game's trailer looks absolutely terrifying, and it seems like it'll be closer to how the remakes play. It's probably a strong reason why they were released, besides just remaking some of the best games in history. Not much is known about the game, but from the trailer it looks like we'll be playing as Grace Ashcroft, daughter of RE Outbreak character Alyssa Ashcroft. It also looks like they'll be returning to the rubble that was once Raccoon City to investigate a string of mysterious deaths. Oh, and you can jump between first and third person at any point in the game. As of the recording of this video, a demo was released during Gamescom, and from what little we've seen, it looks like it's definitely going back to its horror roots. Needless to say, I'm excited to see what the 9th entry will have in store for us. The story of Resident Evil is a great example of how a franchise can lose its identity but return much stronger than it ever was. It's a story about ambitious visions and the development teams that worked around limitations to achieve that vision. And it's a story of how incredible stories can be made if faith is put into the development teams rather than chasing what will help profits. We only got to scratch the surface of some of the development stories in this video, and I highly encourage you to dive in deeper. The stories behind the making of these games are truly fascinating. I hope that you enjoyed this massive video covering a franchise that is really important to me. This required tons of research to do, and it was a huge undertaking from start to finish. If you enjoyed the ride, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and leave a like on the video. If you have any other suggestions for games you want covered, leave a comment down below. This has been Blue Thunder, and thank you for watching.